So if I sit here, I'll be with the back to the Zoom.
But you'll see it on the screen.
You'll see it there,
Okay.
or you can see it on the computer now.
Man, sitting up here like, you
Yes, I
know.
know, this is different than the.
Oh, boy. All right. Well,
You want us to sit close?
sure, that'd be best.
Exalted leader.
This way I'm between the two if I need to.
You're happy where you are.
Well, it's been a film.
And you're gonna leave early. Yeah. Okay. It is my theory that people just simply ought to know what the stories are, because they are our heritage, and they're stories that were never taught in Vacation Bible School, which is where anybody ever learned anything, and because they're definitely in the PG to R range.
So I asked you about this.
So most people don't know that is it working?
Yes, yes, it's working. We can hear you.
Okay. Most people don't know that that David spent many years as an outlaw, for instance, and kind of a Robin Hood. And so I thought, well, let's fill in the gaps. So let's see. Just to check, David got anointed by Samuel as a boy, and his older brothers were ignored. They were warrior types, just like you should have for a king, and this wasn't what God chose. David, there are several stories about how David came in contact with Saul, and one of them was that they knew he was a good harpist and singer, and they brought him in to soothe Saul's mental illness. We say mental, they said he was possessed. Or God's spirit was against him, which was even worse. This particular painting has the sword, the spear, and that hand just gently resting on it. And we know that when he flares up, what he's going to do with that spear. That, I think, you learned in Vacation Bible School. The second story about how David got to meet Saul has to do with being sent by his father to carry food to his brothers who were in battle with Saul's army. And he moves in and enters, he hears the challenge, and then we have David and Goliath, which is a story that we know. Okay. So after that, Saul asks him to remain with the army, and that's how he gets involved. So two different possibilities. And you may say, why two? And it's pretty clear that Samuel was assembled from different manuscripts, and so they're two different stories. So this is where we want to start today, or where I want to start today, whether you do or not. With friendship and hatred. And this is about how David wormed his way in, perhaps, to the family, if you're an enemy of David, and then ultimately usurp the throne, and this, what Samuel writes, or what's in Samuel, is definitely a defense against that accusation. So Jonathan stood at his father's side when David was summoned into Saul's presence. Jonathan felt drawn to David. This was probably God helping David out by giving him a friend. But since David was ordered to stay with the army, Jonathan decided to befriend him. Now, here's where we get to the iffy part. Here in the NRSV translation of this friendship, when David has finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, is the translation. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Now, up to 2000, the assumption had been that this friendship between Jonathan and David was platonic, and commonly it was taught that way. However, now with the spectrum of sexuality, now that the spectrum of sexuality has been given both credence and legality, one cannot read this without wondering if their relationship was one as between lovers. David was poor. He had no decent clothing for wearing until into the king's throne room. David also didn't have any suitable weapons. Goliaths were his by right of battle, but they weren't useful.
Maybe he could have sold them for money.
He could have. It turns out that they exist, and that comes up when he becomes an outlaw. But and he actually uses it, so it shows a great deal of growth if that's the case.
He was still a little boy or a teenager.
Then, yes, but Goliath was a giant. I don't think David ever reached Goliath's proportions, but they just ignore that. Jonathan saw this and gave David one of his own robes and a whole set of armor, helmet, breastplate, shield, spear. And Jonathan knew that Saul would replace Jonathan's armor, and he had more than enough in the ways to wear. So, and again, the two slides above is a traditional way of teaching this story. However, here is what the NRSV translation actually says. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword and his bow and his belt. Jonathan is, in essence, with these gestures, surrendering his right to the throne out of love for David. And I just wonder, is it time to teach here in the 21st century or 22nd? I don't know where we are. Keeps going so fast. So that children struggling with the awareness that they are sexually attracted to the same sex could feel affirmation of normalcy and goodness in this.
Not in Florida.
Not in Florida, that's what I was thinking.
Well, by next year, maybe. Yes.
In the United States.
Yeah. Scary.
When I
Yeah.
read the bulletin announcing what the series was about,
Mhm.
it had the 1 Samuel
Right.
chapters 18 to 20. So I went to the King James version and read that. It's the version of the Bible. that-
Right. Mhm.
And it was more explicit. And I wasn't sure if it was the language, or how I interpret it, but it definitely came across. And that was, the first question I had is, were they homosexual?
Mhm.
And then I thought, how ironic, all this angst that's been going on for over 50 years since Nixon. Yeah.
Mhm. Can you hear?
Oh, maybe I'm talking too softly.
Yes.
Can you hear Mark?
Mostly,
Yes.
Okay, good.
if we can't, we'll ask you to repeat the question or statement, please.
Oh, good. Okay. Anyway, when these stories were assembled into one book, Israel may have been as politically polarized as we are polarized today. Their issue was tribal confederation versus kingship. Also, there were those who believed that David was a ruthless opportunist who wormed his way into Saul's family and ultimately usurped his throne. The stories in Samuel about David's outlaw years are clearly meant to defend David from this accusation.
I think I just want to sort of piggyback on that and say that usually in Vacation Bible School, we don't get this, the political stuff.
No.
And this whole thing about confederation versus kingship is fascinating. But also as we read more through the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, we see the prioritization of Judah over against the other, the northern kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, it shows up in odd little places, you know, as to whether or not it's Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai.
Right.
There are these kind of hints that all of this is going on, but as we know, the winners write history, and so that's even true in a way that we see what's going on in Hebrew scripture.
This is wit.
Yeah, right.
You know, I'll show my ignorance of the Bible. Are David's outlaw years talked about or told, the stories told in the Bible?
That's a question. Are David's outlaw years
Say
what?
again, Whit.
Told in the Bible.
Oh, yeah. This is in the chapters.
That was the preamble.
Right.
Because don't remember those, but that doesn't mean I didn't hear about that.
Yeah, no, you don't hear about it. And partly, I guess, you know, there was a time when in teaching the Bible, you used it as a way to sort of shape good behavior. And so you didn't highlight bad behavior, especially to kids. So
My second question then is, how do we know about David's outlaw years?
there's a good question. And all we know are these are stories that were collected and eventually assembled into the book of Samuel. So this is the last half, I guess, of the book of Samuel, the first book of Samuel. So that's where it is. It's there. But no, we don't talk about it at all.
What does that last state? So David's outlaw years clearly meant to defend David from this accusation.
The story of his attitude during that time, you will find him being very careful about not harming Saul at any point in these stories, and Saul not taking the same advantage, taking the opposite approach.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, so he's now in Saul's army, and David started going out on patrols with units of Saul's army. And whenever David was with a unit, the battles were won, and this shows that God's Spirit is with David, maybe not with Saul. And so Saul put David in charge of an army of 1,000. Everyone seemed to approve of David. Whenever David returned from battling the Philistines, women would grab tambourines and sing songs to celebrate his victories. The verse of one song went, Saul killed 1,000 and David killed 10,000. And when Saul heard this verse, he realized David was popular enough to take over the kingdom. The next day, an evil spirit rushed upon Saul. He went crazy, raving in anger for no apparent reason, and the servants sent David to play the harp. Remember that hand? Suddenly Saul thought, I will pin David to the wall. Saul lifted his spear and threw it. And fortunately, David must have caught the motion of Saul's arm in the corner of his eyes and ducked. Saul grabbed yet another spear, threw and missed again, perhaps because by this time David was running for the door.
Reasonable response.
Or David had a 10-to-1 ratio. Warriors.
Saul was afraid of David because the Lord favored David with success. The Lord was with David. The Lord was not with Saul, and Saul missed the support of God's power. And before COVID, we, I think, discussed the story of how he lost God's favor, but we won't go back over that. So Saul sent David out to engage the Philistines in battle, hoping that David would get killed. However, David was always successful. Saul was in awe of David. All in Israel and Judah seemed to approve or love David. So Saul has moved from anger to the Hebrew word translated awe. Connotations of that word in Hebrew include fear and trembling. So, you know, if you just want to relate to this, have you ever been employed by someone who consciously or unconsciously feared your competence? Yeah, we're all shaking our heads. It was a good idea to change employers, wasn't it?
Have your own spear.
Then Saul said to David, "Here's my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. In exchange, be brave for me in battle." Saul, however, was thinking, "I don't have to kill David. The Philistines will do it for me." David answered humbly, "Who am I, and who are my kinsfolk? My father's family in Israel, that I should be the son-in-law to a king." So you see they're shaping, he's not really trying to worm his way into the family, according to this author. However, when the time came for Merrie to marry, Saul forgot all about this promise to David and gave her to a prince in another kingdom. Now Saul's younger daughter, Michal, I guess, loved David. Saul was told, and the idea pleased him. This is the only place in Hebrew scripture where a woman is said to have loved a man. And that she was able to marry based on that love is extremely rare, since king daughters or any man's daughter usually was given in political arranged marriages.
And then we have potentially homosexual David, Jonathan.
Well, so we can say probably he was bi.
Or maybe not, in society that you take away.
I know, yeah, quite. So, for the second time, Saul thought of making David a son-in-law. He sent servants surreptitiously to find out how David felt about this, and they came back reporting that David as saying, "Does it seem to you a little thing to become a king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor man of no repute?" So Saul again tried to use this against David. He told David that the bride price would be proof that he killed 100 Philistines all by himself. And the proof, this is where you get to the R-rated stuff.
You don't want to answer this to fourth graders, right?
Yep. Again, Saul thought acquiring the proof would kill David. However, David brought that proof. So when David brought that proof, Saul surrendered his daughter David in marriage, and David was pleased to be the king's son-in-law. Still, because David had done what Saul thought impossible, Saul knew once again that God was with David. Saul, afraid of David, opposed David from this moment forward. Truly opposed him before. But meanwhile, as often as the Philistines attacked, David defeated them, and his fame only grew. So throughout this chapter, we know what Saul is thinking. We know very little. I guess you can skip those two answers to the questions. You think this is right, that I should marry a king's daughter, but we know nothing of what David is thinking. Does he return the love of Jonathan and Michal? Does he marry Michal only for status? Is he scheming to take the throne? Is he aware of all that God is doing for him? And how does he handle this public adoration? All of that isn't for us to know, I guess. But you can make it up and write a novel.
Maybe good.
That's what you should do.
Mhm.
Go there.
Yeah, and then they'll change the law and it won't be published.
Or a baby. And then everybody will want.
Well, there's something. The escalation from this small beginning to Saul's eventual tragic collapse was not necessary. All of us experience occasions of unwarranted and self-serving anger, jealousy, and that the success of another is not our own. This chapter makes clear that evil and tragedy grow first from small seeds. Saul is a sad reminder that it makes all the difference whether we resolve jealous anger in repentance and reconciliation or take the road to evil and madness. So, I'm trying to remember when I was last tempted to go down that road.
What does it mean, Merrie, the first sentence, the escalation from this small beginning?
Well, all right. First, he's just a little disturbed that the people like him more than they like Saul. We just lost a connection.
Okay.
And then it grows into a real concern for the throne. And then I think it goes to hatred. I really do. I think he hates the guy before it's all finished. And you'll see
Talking about Saul's attitude, not David coming very
David's
eager at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. No, it's somebody who didn't try to work out, didn't realize that they were jealous and disturbed, and try to work out how to deal with that instead of.
Oh, but if you have mental illness, which we're kind of speculating that you get, that could go narcissism.
Or paranoid schizophrenia,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Or just power.
Sure, hunger for power,
Jealousy, yeah.
sure. I think I was trying to think when the last time, when I was getting ordained, there was a young man who was getting ordained with me. And we were we did it in the same church or whatever. And there were 5 altar guild women making sure that he was outfitted perfectly, and I got to dress myself. And I thought, there's something wrong here. But I didn't blame him.
They didn't know how to handle you, Merrie.
Well, yeah, and very few have. So that's
Those altar guild ladies were like the woman with the tambourines around David.
right.
Funny.
And I was there with the spear. So would you care to share a time when you felt jealous or angry with someone because all was going effortlessly well for them and not for you?
When I was in high school, in the church youth group, I ran for president and the other girl won. And I congratulated her and everything was fine. 4 months later, she had to resign because she became pregnant. Ha ha, they picked the wrong one.
I'll tell
You know, I had an occasion like that in my last job in the oil and gas field. I was vice president of operations for a reasonably good size.
Can you hear out there?
Yes.
Oil and gas. Okay, so here. And what happened is we had a blow up. One of our wells blew out in New Mexico. And at the very end of it, we had just been taken over about 6 months by a bigger company. And the company decided that somebody had to pay for that blow up. And so they decided to let my engineer and myself go. And that was probably one of the lowest points in my life, because I mean, I always got great reviews and everything with this company, and all of a sudden, bam, I was gone. And it was, I was angry, and I guess I wasn't jealous, I was just angry. And now looking back, I should have sued him for a bunch of work. But I mean, it's really interesting, your self-worth for men, a lot of it's tied up in your job. And when suddenly, somebody says, you're gone. It was the most strange thing I ever ran into, because they called me in, they said that they were letting me go. And on my way out of the office, he turns to me and he says, oh, and by the way, you can stay around as long as you want to. And everybody in the company knew that I had been let go. And after about a week of that, I thought,
don't do this. No.
This is not, I need to just leave.
Yeah. So, we're going to do a second set of slides.
It goes to the other set now?
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on, we're technical changes here.
Yeah. Well, I just shared one. I wouldn't want to share all the ones I have been through, all the work I've had to do.
Yeah, because I mean, you're entering into a male.
Yeah, there's, yeah. But,
Okay.
what time are we? How are we doing?
Well, we've got another half hour.
Okay, good. Okay, so here's what Jonathan does for David. And Jonathan isn't running a interference. He's going to be trying to go back and forth between two parties during this entire set of stories. And he is remarkably loyal to his father as well as to David. And I really like Jonathan. I think he did admirably, but that's me. Saul spoke with his son Jonathan and his servants about killing David. Unfortunately for Saul, Jonathan was a great friend of David, and so Jonathan told David that his father planned to kill him, and he told him to hide in a certain field. Jonathan said, I will speak to my father there, and I will tell you what he says. Jonathan told his father that to kill David would be a sin against an innocent person. And Saul finally changed his mind. As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. Saul went home, but Jonathan went to David and brought David back to Saul. Again, there was a war, and David launched a heavy counterattack on the Philistines, which was successful. That came, by the way, I think, from a video game. When David returned to play the harp for Saul, Saul had a spear at hand and tried again to pin David to the wall. David dodged, and the spear lodged in the wall. Saul sent guards to David's house to prevent David from leaving. Saul instructed the guards not to kill David in front of Michal, his daughter, but Saul did plan to kill David when he left his home in the morning. However, being a princess of the court, when Michal saw the guard, she figured out what would happen to David and told him. And she let him down a rope from the window in their home early in the evening, giving time for David to flee and get far away. And then Michal took a statue, probably an idol, and put it in their bed, and she put the goat hair from a rug on its head and covered it with a blanket. And in the morning, when the guards were supposed to take David into custody, Michal lied to them and said he's sick. When the guards, afraid of the princess's power, again checked with Saul, giving David even more time to escape, Saul said, go and get him and kill him. And the guards, of course, found only a statue. This is, this picture is from, I think, a French Bible. Medieval. Saul asked Michal, "Why have you deceived me, and why have you let my enemy go?" And Michal said, "He is no enemy. He told me he has no intention of harming you." So he's on the loose now. It's beginning. David joins Samuel at Ramah. God makes it impossible for Saul to have him arrested, at least there. Now David went from Michal's to Samuel at Ramah and told Samuel all of what Saul had done. Samuel gave David a place to stay in a school for priests and prophets at Naioth. And I don't have it. Oops. Saul sent a second set of soldiers. Let's see if we went too far. Are we going backwards?
Going forward.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Saul sent a set of soldiers to arrest David, and they encountered Samuel and the prophets on the road, and the prophets were in a frenzy. And I don't know if those of you who were with me with Saul, but this happened to Saul too. The same Spirit of God inflamed the hearts of the soldiers, and they started dancing and singing. Saul sent a second set of soldiers, and they too joined this prophetic frenzy.
It was in the water.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Don't drink the Kool-Aid.
Dr. Strangeland.
They sent a third set and ended up dancing too. And then Saul came himself and asked a stranger, where are Samuel and David? And the answer was Naioth at Ramah. And as he neared the town, he too became frenzied. And the next morning, Saul found himself lying on the side of the road. So God's definitely on David's side. David fled from Naioth in Ramah and found Jonathan. The first thing David said was, "What have I done? Why is your father trying to end my life?" Jonathan assured David that he was innocent. So there is a possibility that there were some things he knew he did that maybe increased his esteem in the eyes of people, things like that. He's worried. Jonathan was surprised to hear that David was being chased by Saul's soldiers. Jonathan said that Saul never did anything without telling him, and that's why he's surprised. And now Saul, I think, is caught on. This is the leak.
Could I just add something?
Yeah.
So in the first instance, Jonathan warns David,
Mm-hmm.
and then David leaves.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jonathan
Makes it all right.
intercedes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then goes to David and says, everything's okay, come back. At that point, I would think when Saul now is trying to kill David again, that he was betrayed by Jonathan. Because the way that the sequence works is that Jonathan says, coast is clear, come back. Coast isn't clear. No way is it clear.
But it never was. I mean, the guy's throwing spears at him.
But Jonathan said to David that it was clear.
Right.
So
Jonathan,
if I was David, I would think that Jonathan isn't telling me the truth, that it was a trap.
Right. Except you would have faith in Jonathan for reasons of love.
But he did trap me because I came back and now the king's trying to kill me again.
Yeah.
And it denies everything that Jonathan said. And then here,
or
it's
still
happening
that
all over
Jonathan,
again.
or that Jonathan really didn't know.
I think the idea to kill him in the house might have been actually arranged without Jonathan's knowledge. That would be the only explanation. And I think I'd have to go back through and check for
Well, that would be a leap of faith for David.
Right.
Because
It would
it's left
be.
for Jonathan.
It would be.
Because all the evidence is that
Mhm.
Jonathan is betraying him and he's trapping him by coming back.
But it shows that Jonathan is wisely trusting his father's word.
Unwisely.
Right,
Yes.
unwisely trusting his father's word. But Jonathan was also duped and that
Yes,
Saul was just a liar.
right, just like here, it says Jonathan said that Saul never did anything without telling him. So, that
So he's
shows
surprised
us
by
that
this.
he's
Yeah,
naive, in
Yeah.
a very dangerous way, yeah. Completely.
David suggests, it is possible that your father knows you and I are close friends, and therefore Saul does not tell you what he's planning to do when it involves me.
Or maybe Saul played Jonathan,
Yeah.
saying, hey, everything's fine,
Yeah,
I
right.
want back. And so it was Saul that was laying the trap, using Jonathan as an instrument for his.
And I think that's probably the way you're supposed to read
Yeah,
it,
that
but it
makes
doesn't
sense.
mean that,
Right.
it's probably the way you're
He's
supposed to,
being
because that's
used.
the kind of mind that Saul seems to have. Jonathan nodded agreement with the idea and said, how can I help? Tomorrow is the new moon, and on that day you should sit beside the king at the 2-day feast. Give me permission, he says, to go to Bethlehem and attend the sacrifice there. And Jonathan says, done. So here's a prince giving his knight, I guess would be, permission to do something in the king's name, which he knows pretty well the king wouldn't want. The reason important people would gather once a month with the king was to show Saul that they were still loyal. Not to be at the feast was a sign that you were rebelling against the king, perhaps organizing a portion of the king's army against him. Saul would charge David with treason, i.e., warring against your own country. This was because the word treason might not be known by fourth graders. Simply for not being there. In fact, Saul was intending to do just that, and even if David did show up, Saul planned to arrest him and kill him, though he could not charge him with treason. Now, on the second evening, so there's two evening feasts. If your father mentions my absence at all, then tell him that you gave me permission to be away. If he smiles at that, you will know that he is no longer crazy and I am safe. If he frowns, then you will know he still intends evil. Jonathan, if you ever discover that I, David, intend to harm you or your father or his kingdom, then I hope you will kill me yourself. Okay. Jonathan replied, if I discover that Saul intends to harm you, let him kill me. It's pretty deep loyalty, whatever this is. Now, Jonathan, sensing that he and David were about to part forever, said, while I live, show me the faithful love of the Lord. But if I die, and this Jonathan speaking, I think, never cut off your faithful love from my house. And David promises. Now, what is assumed by these words is that Jonathan and Saul could die. And since Saul did not have God's favor and David could no longer go to battle for Saul in Saul's place, it was likely that these deaths would occur on a battlefield. Should these two men die, David was obviously the obvious choice to be the next king of Israel. Now, what kings starting new dynasties often did was to kill every man, woman, and child of the former king's family. And this way, no one would be alive who could claim to have a better right to the throne than the new king or his heir. What David just promised was not to kill Jonathan's family. Instead, David promised to protect them. The kids didn't like that.
But it includes our wife too, right?
Right. But apparently David's married and has family. My house.
David or Jonathan?
Jonathan, I'm sorry. Thank you. Apparently Jonathan's married. Jonathan said, tomorrow, the next day, Saul will miss you. And on that third day, come to this field and hide among the rocks. I will come with a boy to practice archery, shooting arrows to land near those rocks. If I say to the boy, look beyond those rocks for the arrow, you will know that you must flee. And if I say anything else, you will know that you are safe to come out from behind the rocks and return to my father's service. So Jonathan and David part company basically forever, though they will see each other one more time. The king sat on his seat by the wall. Jonathan stood. Abner sat by the king's side, but David's place on the other side of the king was empty. The king pretended to his son that David should be there, and he asked Jonathan where David might be. Jonathan said that he had given David permission to go to the feast with his family in Bethlehem. Saul's anger kindled against his son. He cursed him and accused him of choosing David's interests over those of his father's. Saul announced to everyone that David would die for not being there. Jonathan lost his temper and shouted, "Why? What has he done?" Because Jonathan had challenged his father's decisions in front of the whole army, Saul threw a spear at Jonathan.
This thing about speakers.
Then Saul screamed, "Unless we stop David now, you, my son, will have no future as king, nor will your sons." Jonathan realized that nothing he could do would change his father's mind. Jonathan stormed out without eating, angry that his father was so out of control that he nearly killed his firstborn son. Jonathan also grieved for David. The next day, Jonathan shot arrows near the rock, allowed the boy to gather them, but called out that he thought that they had gone further beyond the rock. And when the boy came back with all the arrows, he sent the child on home to the city. David then rose from his hiding place. David said goodbye. It was the second time David saw Jonathan, the second to the last time that he saw Jonathan alive. And that's as far as I was going to go today. So.
Cliffhanger.
So,
Well, thank you.
yeah. So, any comments on this or thoughts?
I think it confirms that Saul was using Jonathan to trap David.
Yeah.
Every time.
Mm-hmm.
And Jonathan didn't get it until the very end. Sad.
Pretty
And
heavy
yet-
stuff.
Yeah, Jonathan does not remove his loyalty from his father. He continues to fight at his father's side and let David go. And ultimately, well, I don't want to blow the story. If you haven't read it, although it's quite available. So if you want to read ahead, you're welcome.
They're such great stories.
Well, they are. And any story that makes it that many centuries and eons, or rather through time, through that process has been polished to the point where everything in there is just more or less where it needs to be. And it leaves questions purposely so that, if you're sitting around a campfire to telling that story, you have lots to talk about, such as what's Jonathan thinking, which isn't there. I mean, that's the novelist again.
Like your image of sitting around the campfire telling the story, because we're sitting there listening to the story and we're saying, wait a minute, I heard this. And so, what? Yeah, kind of, but I heard this, and then that all gets sort of mashed together in whatever gets put down as the official version.
Yeah. So, any comments from the, I almost said that, but that's not true. So.
What do you think the message is? I mean, it makes for the premise of a great novel, but the Bible, that's not the Bible's intent. It's to present a message, I think, always by allegory.
You know, and so I think you first of all, there'd be the message about how do you model your behavior. And so you could take each character and you have a model. And, you know, at this point you could say, well, how many of you want to be Saul? That kind of thing. But also you have a model for mental illness there too. And what do you do with a person with a great power who can't be deposed?
Right.
You know, how do you get along with that? Well, that might speak to some things we've experienced. But like I said, I find myself just amazed at Jonathan. You know, David's not given a whole lot of you don't know what's going on in David's mind. That'll come later. But this is Jonathan's story as far as I'm concerned. And his, you know, being caught between two great loyalties is what it's about. And how do you balance that? And when do you quit and choose one over the other? He never does, really. So that would be my thought as to how to do this. And again, we're talking a story that I've simplified. You can probably find much more tangles in the actual text. So, but it's important to know. I mean, how many of you knew that Jonathan, you know, was so active in helping David at this point in his career? And that's something I think fourth graders need to know. They, you know, there are other parts you can leave out.
You know, I'm trying to remember what we learned in EFM, and I think we just glossed right over it. Thank you, Ron.
Yeah, it's amazing what happens when you read Hebrew scriptures rather than a summary. You know,
It's pretty all in there.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of it we don't read on Sunday mornings either.
No,
even in the daily office lectionary, it doesn't always show up.
So I guess homosexuality was acknowledged, but it wasn't necessarily approved. It was like the don't say, don't tell, or don't ask, don't tell. In that both David and Jonathan had to have these trophy wives in order to legitimize themselves in society, although they still had love for each other.
And I'm sure, you know, with the kind of the prevalence of homosexuality, that there was things were being worked out all over.
Yeah.
You know, and it would depend on probably how much influence the religious aspects of society had on it during a particular reign, whether they would come in and try to enforce or not, which is sort of where we are now. I mean,
when we think of modern day homosexuality, you know, that term I don't think was coined until the 1940s.
Right.
I don't think, you in ancient Israel that they really thought about homosexuality. There was a lot of evidence to show that men in power would use boys or servants as an alternative for sexual desires. And I'm not sure that it was mutual at all. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a very interesting story, which does, in fact, ask a lot of questions. I understand that. But I'm not so sure that they thought men having sex with other men or boys was necessarily against the law or an evil thing, because it was so male dominated at that time.
Mhm.
I was thinking, wasn't procreation a major issue involved in all that too? So as long as they have wives and they're having children.
You know,
The question, several questions. I mean, there are, in all the cultures, questions of both male prostitutes and female prostitutes, and everybody was going in everybody else. And so then there was the question of procreation, making sure you had the children
In your trauma.
So we just see all of this through 20th, 19th,
Right.
20th century eyes that have a good way of processing it. I'm struck often, and Mark has in some respects alluded to it, that there's language in the King James Version that we would not want to read anymore because it would offend people. But if you want to offend people, just read it in the original. and it really offends them. But their predilections and niceties were very different than ours. And so we bring our own sets of lenses to these, and it's always fascinating to see what might have been behind some of these stories that challenges our preconceptions.
If you have a truly male-dominated society, and there is a belief that and you're 36 and you marry a 14-year-old or a 16-year-old woman, that you're not meant to have equal, status or even conversations that mean anything to one another. And so where do you go for that kind of companionship? And of course, it's other men your age, I presume. And similarly, women would go to other women their age, I should think.
We read about and hear about all of these women who become queens.
Mm-hmm.
And they have this entourage around them. Right? It's not this sort of soul thing. It's not, and all of these other people, talk to, and all of this other kind of stuff. Provide a social. You might only see the king once a year.
Yeah, exactly.
How many concubines some of these kings had?
Well, and then there were harems, so well guarded. So anyway.
Very interesting. Thank you, Merrie.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Thank you, Merrie.
You're welcome. I enjoy doing this, so thank you.
That's good because
pictures are great.
So we'll take on the next group next time. And
Merrie, I have to ask you, are these the type of lessons you taught at St. Anne's?
the whole business about homosexuality, I left out of it.
Just curious.
I didn't have authority to do so. That would have, now I'm not sure. They might ask me to do it because the whole atmosphere there and everywhere has changed,
But we grew up in a society that homosexuality was left out of it. At least I did.
Yeah, I didn't.
We didn't know anything.
Yeah.
And if you were gay, you were happy, in those days.
Yeah, right.
So,
Yep. Turn off.
I will
Okay.
shut everything down.
All right, bye, guys.
Bye.
Wherever you are.
The cloud of witness.